She was 19 years old, and for all intents and purposes, an orphan left to the cold mercies of a world that had already taken her mother. Her stepfather's family had cast her out with nothing more than the clothes on her back, a worn carpet bag, and a single $5 bill. With that, and a faded scrap of deerskin clutched in her hand, she walked away from the settlement of Flat Creek and followed an old trail into the Bitterroot Mountains. But what nobody knew, what her mother had carefully hidden from a dismissive world, was that the trail did not lead to an end, but to a beginning, waiting for her in the deep quiet of a mountain cave. Settle in and listen close, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Clara Winslow. Clara's world had always been small, defined by the scent of wood smoke, lye soap, and the damp wool of other people's lives. Her mother, Eleanor Winslow, was the laundress for the small Montana settlement of Flat Creek, a woman whose existence was measured in the stacks of clean, folded linens she returned to the miners, the blacksmith, and the storekeeper's wife. To the town, Eleanor was a quiet fixture, tireless and uncomplaining, a widow who had married the widower Silas Croft, more for the security of a roof than for any illusion of affection. They saw a plain woman with chapped hands and a perpetually weary slope to her shoulders, and they saw nothing more. But Clara saw the truth. She saw the keen intelligence in her mother's eyes as she watched the evening sky, predicting a frost that would save a neighbor's fledgling garden. She felt the deliberate strength in her hands, not just from scrubbing clothes, but from the way she could set a snare, split kindling with a single, precise strike, and stitch a wound as cleanly as any doctor. Eleanor was a woman who had learned the hard lessons of self-reliance and had passed them on to her daughter not as chores, but as scripture. Every lesson was a verse in the gospel of survival. "The world doesn't owe you softness, Clara," she would say, her voice low as they salted fish by the creek. "But it will give you what you need if you know how to look." So Clara learned. She learned which mushrooms were a meal and which were a grave. She learned to read the stories left in mud and snow by deer and elk. She learned the quiet patience of mending, her stitches becoming as small and even as her mother's, a skill that taught her to fix what was broken rather than discard it. Her mother was her only true mentor, a silent teacher who communicated more in the shared work of their days than in spoken words. And their most precious secret, the one thing that belonged only to them, was a small, soft piece of deerskin. On it, Eleanor had drawn a map in charcoal and berry juice, a winding line that started at the oldest pine tree behind their cabin and disappeared into the jagged blue lines that represented the mountains. "This is our secret way home," Eleanor had told her one evening, folding the deerskin and placing it in Clara's hand. "If you ever need a place that's only yours, you follow this." Clara never understood what she meant. Not really, but she treasured the object. It was a tangible piece of her mother's love, a promise of a place beyond the hard life in Flat Creek, a life made harder by her stepfather, Silas. Silas Croft was a man hollowed out by disappointments, and he filled the space with a simmering resentment. He had married Eleanor for her industry, expecting a silent servant, and he treated Clara as a consequence of that bargain, an extra mouth to feed. His two grown sons, Jeb and Thomas, inherited their father's narrowness of spirit and saw Clara as an unwelcome ghost in their home, a reminder that their father's house had once belonged to another man, her father, who had died in a mining collapse years before Eleanor married Silas. They tolerated her presence as long as her mother was alive, her labor a vital part of the household's meager economy. But when the winter fever came, swift and merciless, and took Eleanor in the space of 3 days, that tolerance evaporated like frost in the morning sun. The end of Clara's life in Flat Creek did not come with a storm of anger or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, a week after her mother was buried in the frozen ground of the settlement's small cemetery. The air in the cabin was thick with a new kind of silence, no longer the companionable quiet of shared work, but the empty, sterile silence of absence. Silas sat at the head of the rough-hewn table, his sons Jeb and Thomas on either side, their faces set in the grim, practical lines of men about to conduct a piece of unpleasant business. Clara stood by the hearth, her mother's woolen shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the last lingering scent of her clinging to the fibers. Silas cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. "Clara," he began, not looking at her, "your ma is gone. We're sorry for it. But things are what they are." He gestured vaguely around the small room. "This cabin, the land, it's mine now. There's no inheritance to speak of. Your mother brought nothing into this marriage but her own 2 hands." It was a lie, of course. The cabin had been her father's, but Eleanor, a woman alone, had signed it over to Silas upon their marriage for the sake of propriety and protection. A piece of paper had erased her history. "We're simple men," Jeb added, his voice flat. "We can't afford to keep another person who ain't our blood. There ain't enough work or food to go around." Thomas, the younger and somehow crueler of the two, simply pushed a small, worn carpet bag across the floor with the toe of his boot. "Ma's things are in there," he grunted. What little there was. Silas finally met her gaze, his own eyes holding no malice, only a profound and weary indifference. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins and a folded bill, placing them on the table. "This is $5, he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "It's more than we can spare, but it'll see you to the next town. You're a hard worker. You'll find a place." Clara looked from his face to the money on the table, and then to the bag at her feet. She did not cry. She did not plead or argue. Her mother had taught her that begging only deepens the humiliation. Dignity was in the straightness of your spine, in the quiet way you accepted the inevitable and moved on. She walked to the table, picked up the $5, and tucked it into her pocket. She bent down and lifted the carpet bag, its weight familiar and sorrowful in her hand. Inside, she knew, would be her mother's spare dress, her brush, a small book of psalms, and the sewing kit that had mended half the town's clothes. She turned back to the 3 men, who were already looking away, their duty done, their consciences, such as they were, clear. Her gaze swept the cabin one last time. The stone hearth she and her mother had swept 1,000 times. The narrow bed she had shared with her. The window that looked out onto the woods. There was nothing left for her here. Without another word, she opened the cabin door and stepped out into the cold, thin air of the Montana spring. The door clicked shut behind her, a sound of absolute finality. She did not look back. She clutched the bag in one hand, and with the other, she reached into the deep pocket of her skirt and felt for the soft, folded square of deerskin. Her mother's map. Her secret way home. The path away from Flat Creek was not a road, but a memory. Clara walked north, leaving the muddy track that led to the next settlement and turning instead toward the dark line of timber that marked the beginning of the mountains. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, a rhythm her mother had taught her for covering long distances without exhausting oneself. The carpet bag was awkward, its handle digging into her palm, but she shifted it from hand to hand, refusing to let its burden slow her. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine needles and thawing earth. The sun, when it broke through the clouds, was a pale, watery yellow, offering little warmth. She followed the creek that gave the settlement its name, its water running high and fast with melted snow, the sound a constant, rushing companion. For the first few hours, the landscape was familiar, the woods she had foraged in with her mother since she was a small child. She recognized the stand of birch trees where they gathered bark for tinder, the mossy boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the clearing where wild strawberries grew in the summer. Each landmark was a fresh pang of grief, a reminder of the life that had been so brutally amputated. But as the day wore on, the terrain began to change. The ground grew steeper, the trees taller and thicker, casting the forest floor in a deep, perpetual twilight. She was entering the true wilderness now, the vast, untamed expanse of the Bitterroot Range. Here, the trail was no longer a path worn by habit, but a series of subtle signs her mother had taught her to read. She consulted the deerskin map, its markings a cryptic language only she could understand. A notch carved into the trunk of a towering spruce, weathered and silvered with age. 3 flat stones stacked one atop the other near a game trail. A lightning-scarred pine whose broken top pointed exactly northeast. These were the signposts of her journey, a secret correspondence between a mother and daughter across the Vale of Death. As evening approached, a cold wind began to sweep down from the high peaks, carrying the threat of a late spring snow. Clara felt the familiar ache of fatigue settle into her bones, her hunger a dull, persistent knot in her stomach. She knew she had to find shelter. She left the faint trail and scrambled down a short, steep embankment to the edge of the creek. There, tucked beneath an overhanging granite ledge, was a space just large enough for her to shelter from the wind. It was a place her mother had shown her once, years ago. "Always look for the land's kindness," she had said. "A rock that blocks the wind, a dry patch under a great tree. The mountain will care for you if you let it." Clara gathered dry leaves and pine needles, creating a small, insulated bed against the cold rock. She ate a piece of hard bread she had saved from her last meal at the cabin, chewing it slowly, making it last. She drank deeply from the icy, pure water of the creek. She did not build a fire, not wanting to draw the attention of predators, animal or human. Huddled under her mother's shawl, she watched the stars emerge, impossibly bright and close in the clear mountain air. There was a profound loneliness in the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains. But there was also a strange comfort. Out here, she was not an outcast or a burden. She was simply a living creature, subject to the same rules as the deer and the hawk. Find food, find shelter, endure. Her grief was a heavy stone inside her, but her mother's lessons were the muscles that allowed her to carry it. She slept fitfully, waking to the distant howl of a wolf and the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. But fear was a luxury she could not afford. She had a destination. She had a map. And for the first time since her mother's death, she had a purpose beyond simple survival. She was going home. The next day, and the day after that, the journey continued. The terrain grew more rugged, the trail a mere whisper on the landscape. She crossed rushing streams on fallen logs, her feet numb with cold. She climbed steep, scree-covered slopes, her lungs burning, her hands raw from gripping rock and root. The carpet bag became an impossible burden, and she finally stopped, opened it, and made a hard choice. She kept the sewing kit, her mother's brush, and the shawl. The rest, the dress, the psalm book, she wrapped carefully in oilcloth and buried beneath the roots of an ancient cedar, marking the spot. She fashioned a small bundle she could tie to her back, freeing her hands. She was lighter now, moving more easily through the dense forest. She ate wild onions and the tender shoots of spring plants, her hunger abating. She was becoming part of the mountain, her senses sharpening, her body hardening to the demands of the wilderness. Finally, on the afternoon of the fourth day, she saw it. A landmark from the deerskin map she had been searching for. A waterfall, a shimmering curtain of white water cascading down a sheer rock face, its roar filling the small canyon. According to the map, her destination was near. The waterfall was more beautiful and more powerful than the simple drawing on the deerskin could convey. It thundered into a deep, turquoise pool, sending a perpetual mist into the air that clung to the moss-covered rocks and nourished the ferns growing in every crevice. Clara stood for a long moment, the cool spray on her face washing away the dust and fatigue of her journey. The map showed a small symbol just behind the waterfall, a circle that meant shelter or home in the private language she and her mother had shared. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Taking a deep breath, she picked her way carefully along the slippery edge of the pool, moving toward the rock face. The space behind the falls was narrow, a slick, wet ledge barely wide enough for her feet. She pressed herself flat against the cold stone, the roar of the water deafening, its force a tangible pressure against her body. She edged along, inch by inch, until she was fully behind the curtain of water. And there it was, not a wide-open entrance, but a dark, narrow fissure in the rock, almost completely concealed by the cascade. It was an opening that no one would ever find by accident. She squeezed through the crack and found herself in sudden, profound silence. The roar of the waterfall was instantly muffled, becoming a distant, rhythmic rumble. She was in a small, dry antechamber. A few more steps took her around a bend in the rock, and the passage opened into a large, high-ceilinged cavern. A pale, ethereal light filtered down from a natural fissure high above, illuminating a space that was not a raw, wild cave, but a carefully prepared refuge. This was the acquisition. This was the home her mother had promised. Against one wall, a neat stack of firewood, dry and seasoned, reached nearly to the ceiling. Next to it sat a small, pot-bellied stove, its stovepipe expertly fitted into a natural chimney in the rock. There were two simple wooden cots with thick wool blankets folded neatly upon them. A rough-hewn table and two stools stood in the center of the cavern floor. Shelves carved into the rock itself held an astonishing array of supplies: sacks of flour, beans, and oats sealed in tin-lined wooden crates to protect them from moisture and rodents. Jars of preserved berries and dried apples, tins of lard and coffee, smoked and salted strips of jerky hanging from hooks. It was a larder stocked for a long winter, a testament to years of patient, secret labor. On another set of shelves, she found tools: an axe, a saw, a hammer, a box of nails, fishing line and hooks, a good rifle with a box of ammunition, and a set of well-cared-for skinning knives. This was more than a shelter. It was a fully equipped homestead, hidden away from the world. Clara walked through the space in a daze, running her hand over the smooth, worn wood of the table, touching the soft wool of the blankets. Every object was evidence of her mother's foresight, her quiet, fierce love. She had been preparing this place for years, creating a sanctuary, a fallback for a future she must have feared. For Clara. Overwhelmed, she sank onto one of the cots, the rough blanket a comforting weight. The grief she had held so tightly in her chest finally broke free. Not in a storm of sobs, but in quiet, steady tears that rolled down her cheeks and dripped onto her dusty clothes. They were tears not just of sorrow, but of a profound, heart-aching gratitude. She was not abandoned. She had never been abandoned. Her mother had seen the cruelty in Silas and his sons, had understood the precariousness of their life, and had built this ark in secret, a haven against the coming flood. Eleanor Winslow had not been a simple laundress. She had been a survivor, a planner, a protector, and this cave was her final, greatest gift to her daughter. After the first wave of emotion passed, a deep sense of purpose settled over Clara. This place was not just a refuge, it was a responsibility. She spent the next few days taking inventory, familiarizing herself with the intricate, hidden world her mother had built. She found a spring of fresh, cold water trickling from the back wall of the cave, channeled by a series of small, carefully placed stones into a stone basin. She found a collection of seeds, corn, squash, and beans, stored in airtight clay jars. Her mother had planned not just for survival, but for a future, for a life to be lived here. While organizing the shelves, her fingers brushed against a loose stone in the back of a deep recess. It was different from the others, slightly smaller and set with a thin line of dried mud around its edges. Curious, she pried at it with the tip of a knife. It came free, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. Reaching inside, her hand closed around the cold, smooth wood of a small chest. It was made of dark, polished cedar, bound with iron straps, and it was locked. A fresh search began, this time for a key. She looked everywhere, in the pockets of the spare coat hanging on a peg, in the tins of coffee and tea, under the mattresses of the cots. Nothing. Finally, exhausted, she sat down on a cot and picked up one of the heavy wool blankets, the one from the top of the pile. As she ran her hands over it, she felt a small, hard lump sewn into the corner hem. With trembling fingers, she used her knife to carefully snip the thick threads. A small, ornate iron key fell into her palm. It was the moment of discovery. She carried the key and the chest to the table, the pale light from the ceiling fissure illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The key slid into the lock with a soft, metallic click. She lifted the heavy lid. The chest was divided into two compartments. On one side, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a heavy leather pouch tied with a drawstring. She lifted it, surprised by its weight, and loosened the knot. A stream of dull, gray-blue stones tumbled onto the table, clicking softly against the wood. They were uncut and unpolished, but even in the dim light, they held a deep, captivating color. Sapphires. Dozens of them, some as small as a pea, others as large as a robin's egg. On the other side of the chest lay two items: a thick journal bound in worn leather, and a single folded document, yellowed with age and tied with a faded red ribbon. Clara set the pouch of stones aside and reverently picked up the journal. It was her mother's. The handwriting was the same neat, careful script she had seen on countless lists for supplies. But here, the words flowed with a different purpose. She opened to the first page. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has shown you its colder side, as I always feared it might. But do not be afraid. This place is yours now. Everything here I did for you." Clara read on, page after page, the story of her mother's secret life unfolding. Eleanor had not been born to a life of laundry. Her father had been a prospector, and she had spent her childhood in mining camps, learning to read the land, to recognize the signs of gold, silver, and gemstones. After her first husband, Clara's father had died. She had returned to the only skill she had left from that life. She had begun exploring the high creeks in secret, panning in her few stolen hours of freedom. And in this creek, the one that fed the waterfall, she had found them. The sapphires. The journal detailed years of patient work. A few stones gathered each trip, carried back in secret, and added to the cache. She described how she had used a handful of the smaller, less valuable stones, sold quietly in a town 100 miles away, to buy the stove, the tools, the rifle, and the supplies, hauling them up to the cave piece by piece over 5 years. But it was the document tied with the ribbon that held the greatest secret. Clara carefully untied the knot and unfolded the paper. It was a legal mineral claim, properly filed and stamped by the Montana Territorial Land Office in Helena, dated 6 years prior. It claimed, for mining purposes, the entire length of the creek, from its source in the high peaks down to the waterfall, and 100 yards of land on either side. The name on the claim was not Silas Croft's, it was Eleanor Winslow's, and as her sole heir, it now belonged to Clara. Her mother hadn't just found a few pretty stones. She had discovered and legally secured one of the richest sapphire deposits in the territory. The laundress, the quiet, overlooked woman, had outsmarted them all. The final entry in the journal was dated only a few months before Eleanor's death. The claim is secure. The shelter is ready. I hope you never need it, my sweet girl. I hope your life is soft and easy. But if it is not, know that I have left you a foundation. I have left you the earth itself. Build your life on this rock, Clara. Be strong, be smart, and never ever let anyone make you feel small. Your loving mother, Eleanor. Clara closed the journal, holding it to her chest. The sapphires on the table were not just wealth, they were a legacy. The claim was not just a piece of paper, it was a declaration of independence. Her mother had given her more than a refuge. She had given her power. The first days after the discovery were a blur of reading and planning. Clara absorbed every word of her mother's journal, which was not only a chronicle of her life but also a detailed manual. Eleanor had recorded the best places along the creek to pan, the specific type of gravel that yielded the most stones, and her own self-taught methods for building a simple but effective sluice box to speed up the process. The journal was a final set of lessons from her mentor. Clara understood that the sapphires in the chest were a starting fund, but the true value lay in the creek itself and the legal paper that gave her ownership of it. Her first priority was to ensure the claim was recognized as hers. The world of men, laws, and property was a foreign and intimidating one, but her mother's final words echoed in her mind. Be smart. She knew she could not simply walk into Flat Creek and declare her inheritance. Silas and his sons would try to take it from her. Others would see a young, lone woman as an easy target. She needed an ally, someone who understood this world. The journal provided one. In a few entries, her mother mentioned an old prospector named Jedediah Stone, a man she had trusted enough to ask for advice on filing the claim. Jed is a man as solid as his name, Eleanor wrote. He keeps his own counsel and judges people by their grit, not their station. He lived, according to the journal, in a small cabin a day's walk downriver, far from any settlement. Clara packed a small bag with food, the claim document, the journal, and a handful of the smaller sapphires. She secured the cave, camouflaging the entrance behind the waterfall even more carefully, and set off to find him. Jedediah Stone's cabin was exactly as described. A small, tidy structure of chinked logs with a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Jed himself was a man who seemed carved from the mountain, with a wild gray beard, hands like gnarled roots, and eyes the pale, clear blue of a winter sky. He was wary when she approached, his hand resting on the handle of an old pistol tucked into his belt. Clara did not waste words. "My name is Clara Winslow," she said, her voice steady. "My mother was Eleanor Winslow." The name got his attention. His eyes narrowed, studying her face. "I see her in you," he said after a long moment, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He gestured toward the cabin. "Come in out of the wind." Inside, she told him her story, laying the claim document and the journal on his table. He listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the papers. He picked up one of the sapphires she offered, turning it over in his calloused fingers, holding it up to the light. "Yogo sapphires," he murmured, a note of reverence in his voice. "The best in the territory. Your mother was a sharp one, a real sharp one." He confirmed her fears. Her claim was legal and binding, but it would be challenged. She needed to go to the county seat in Junction City, not Flat Creek, and have the inheritance legally transferred and recorded with the territorial registrar. He gave her practical, specific advice. "Don't show all your cards, girl. Don't show them the big stones. Take a few of the medium ones, enough to prove the claim is productive, enough to pay the fees and buy what you need. Keep the rest hidden. Wealth makes people foolish, and foolish people are dangerous." He then did something more. He drew her a map to Junction City, marking a safe route, and gave her the name of the registrar, a man named Abernathy he knew to be fair. "Tell him Jed Stone sent you," he said. "It might not help, but it won't hurt." The journey to Junction City took 2 days. It was a larger, busier town than Flat Creek, and Clara felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. But she held her head high, walking with the confidence her mother's legacy had given her. Mr. Abernathy was a stern-faced man with spectacles and an air of weary bureaucracy. He looked at Clara with skepticism, but when she mentioned Jed Stone's name and presented her mother's original claim and death notice, his demeanor shifted to one of professional diligence. He verified the documents against the territorial records, his pen scratching as he made notes. "The claim is in order," he announced finally, peering at her over his glasses. "The transfer of title to you as the sole heir is straightforward." He did not pry or ask how a laundress's daughter came to possess such a thing. He simply did his job. The law, for once, was on her side. With the legalities settled, Clara's rebuilding began in earnest. She sold 3 of the mid-sized sapphires to the town assayer, a transaction she navigated with the shrewdness Jed had advised. The sum she received was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was not a fortune, but it was a foundation. She did not squander it. She bought a sturdy pack mule, a new set of high-quality mining tools, picks, shovels, and a set of classifying screens, and enough provisions to last for months. Her last stop was the blacksmith's shop to order a custom-fitted grate for her sluice box. The blacksmith's wife, a kind, sturdy woman named Martha Gable, saw the quiet determination in the young woman's eyes. Seeing that Clara had nowhere to stay, she offered her a room for the night and a hot meal, a simple act of generosity that felt monumental. "You look like a girl who knows her own mind," Mrs. Gable said, ladling stew into a bowl. "The world needs more of that." Clara returned to the mountains not as a fleeing orphan, but as a homesteader, an entrepreneur. The mule, laden with supplies, followed her patiently up the trail. She had faced the world of men and laws and had not been found wanting. The physical rebuilding started the next day. Following her mother's diagrams, she began constructing a sluice box near the creek, a long wooden trough with riffles to catch the heavy sapphires, Jed Stone appeared a week later, as if by instinct, and silently helped her, his expertise invaluable. He showed her how to position the box to get the best water flow, how to secure it against the spring runoff. They worked together in comfortable silence, their communication based on the shared language of practical work. He was the first member of her new, small community. The work was grueling, but deeply satisfying. Each shovelful of gravel washed through the sluice was an act of creation, of building her future. And at the end of each day, as she cleaned the riffles, she would find them. Small, beautiful glints of blue and gray, her mother's legacy made real, gathered from the cold mountain water. The cave, once a desperate refuge, slowly transformed into a true home. With the money from her first sale of sapphires, Clara had purchased not just tools and provisions, but small comforts as well. A proper mattress for her cot, a few books, kerosene for a brighter lamp, and a small cast-iron cookstove that she installed in place of the more primitive pot-bellied heater. The scent of baking bread soon mingled with the clean, earthy smell of the cavern. She built sturdy shelves, a new table, and a comfortable chair. Her carpentry skills, learned from mending fences and furniture with her mother, proving surprisingly adept. The cave became a place of warmth and order, a sanctuary of her own making. News of the Winslow claim traveled slowly at first, a rumor carried by a traveling tinker who had heard whispers in Junction City. When it finally reached Flat Creek, it was met with disbelief, then scorn, and finally, a simmering, covetous anger. Silas Croft and his sons were the most vocal. They declared it was a fraud, that Eleanor had never been smart enough to file a claim, that Clara must have stolen it or tricked some fool into signing it over. They rode to Junction City to challenge it, but Mr. Abernathy, armed with the law and his own meticulous records, sent them away with a curt dismissal. The claim was ironclad. Defeated and humiliated, their resentment toward Clara hardened into a bitter poison. But others in the territory had a different reaction. Prospectors and miners, who understood the value of a good strike and the luck and labor it required, regarded her with a grudging respect. They began to speak of the Winslow sapphires and the girl in the waterfall cave. She became a local legend, a figure of mystery and admiration. Her quiet solitude and the natural fortress of her claim protected her. Few were willing to brave the rugged terrain to bother her, and those who did found a young woman who was polite but firm, her rifle never far from her side, her eyes clear and steady. She was not to be trifled with. Her small community, founded on quiet acts of practical generosity, began to grow. Jedediah Stone became a regular visitor, arriving every few weeks with news from the outside world and a pouch of tobacco to share. He never offered unsolicited advice, but would answer her questions about mining, the weather, and the changing seasons with the wisdom of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the Book of the Mountains. Martha Gable from Junction City would send packages for her with the mail carrier, who traveled a route 20 miles to the south. A new novel, a jar of her spiced apple butter, a warm knitted scarf for the winter. These small connections were anchors, reminding Clara that she was not entirely alone. Small rituals began to shape her days. She would rise before the sun, start the coffee, and walk to the creek in the crisp morning air. She worked the sluice box through the daylight hours, the rhythm of shovel and water becoming a kind of meditation. In the evenings, she would sit by her stove, sorting the day's haul of sapphires, reading her mother's journal, or writing in her own. The unwanted cave had become her castle, her workshop, and her refuge. The stream was no longer just a source of water, but the source of her livelihood, her independence. People in the territory knew her name now. She was no longer Eleanor's forgotten daughter or Silas's unwanted stepchild. She was Clara Winslow, the owner of Sapphire Creek. The title was not one of nobility, but it was one of substance, earned through her mother's foresight and her own relentless labor. It was a position of respect, built not on declarations or fancy things, but on the solid, functional reality of her work, her claim, and the warm, purposeful life she had carved out for herself, deep in the heart of the mountains. One evening in late autumn, as the first snows began to dust the highest peaks, Clara stood at the entrance of her cave, looking out through the shimmering veil of the waterfall. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet, the colors reflected in the turbulent water of the plunge pool. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a quiet contentment that felt as solid and real as the stone at her back. She had spent the day building a small, sturdy cabin just outside the cave entrance, on a flat ledge overlooking the creek. It wasn't large, just a single room to serve as a proper living space, leaving the cave for storage and as a workshop. The scent of freshly cut pine from the new walls filled the air. This was hers. Not just the sapphires, not just the claim, but this life, this place, this quiet moment of peace. She turned and went back inside, the cave warm and inviting from the heat of the cook stove. On the new mantelpiece she had built over the stone hearth, two objects sat side by side. One was the soft, creased scrap of deerskin, its map now a treasured artifact, a symbol of the journey that had brought her here. Next to it sat a single, magnificent sapphire she had found in her mother's chest. It was a deep, cornflower blue, perfectly formed and shaped like a heart. Eleanor had set it aside, a silent message of love. Clara looked at the two objects, the map that had guided her and the heart that had been waiting for her, and saw the full arc of her mother's story. Eleanor Winslow was not the woman Flat Creek had known. She was not a simple laundress defined by her labor, nor a victim defined by her losses. She was a strategist, a provider, a quiet revolutionary who had played the long game and won. She had seen the contempt in men like Silas Croft and had built her daughter a fortress against it, not of anger or revenge, but of stone and water and legal ink. She had armed Clara with skills, with knowledge, and with a tangible inheritance that could never be taken away. She thought of Silas and his sons, trapped in their small cabin and their even smaller lives, their greed having left them with nothing but the bitter ashes of resentment. They had cast her out with $5, believing they were ridding themselves of a burden. They had no idea they were setting her free. Her mother's love had been a hidden current, running deep and silent beneath the surface of their hard life, and it had carried her here, to this place of safety and strength. Clara Winslow was 19 when her family cast her out with $5 and a worn carpet bag. She had nothing to her name but a deerskin map and a legacy she didn't yet understand. She followed that map into the mountains and spent her last dollar on the fees to claim her birthright. It was the best money she ever spent. For those of you who have stayed with us through Clara's journey, we thank you. If her story of resilience and hidden strength moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who might find inspiration in it, and subscribe for more tales of quiet courage. We leave you with this question. What hidden maps have been left for you, and what undiscovered country might they lead to in your own life? What would you do if the world took everything from you, leaving you with nothing but a single silver dollar and the clothes on your back? What if that dollar, a coin heavy with insult and dismissal, was the only price you could pay for a new life? For one young woman, cast out and alone at 18, she bought a $1 abandoned mine cabin, a place the world had already stripped of value and left for dead. But the truth waiting inside, walled up in the cold dark of a forgotten shaft, would change not only her life, but the soul of an entire town. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Ilara Vance and the secret of the Althea Lode. The dust of the trail had settled into the very weave of her dress, a uniform of grief and grit. Ilara Vance rode into the town of Dust Devil Gulch, not with hope, but with the dull weight of necessity. She was 18 years old, though the look in her eyes belonged to someone much older, someone who had already seen one life end. Her horse, a gray gelding named Shale with a swayed back and a patient soul, was the last living link to the world that had vanished just a week before. The memory was a raw splinter in her mind. Her mother's shallow breathing in the small cabin they'd shared, the scent of pine and illness, and then the terrible silence. The day after the funeral, her stepfather, Silas, a man whose heart was as hard and barren as the land he worked, had pressed a single cold dollar into her palm. "This settles it," he'd said, his voice flat. "Your mother's gone. This place is mine now. Be gone by morning." He hadn't looked at her. He had looked past her, at the horizon, as if she were already a ghost. That dollar wasn't payment. It was a final, clean severance. It was meant to say, "You are worth nothing more than this." And so she had taken Shale, the horse her mother had loved, packed a small satchel with bread, a blanket, and her mother's worn wooden spoon, and ridden away without looking back. Now, the town of Dust Devil Gulch rose before her, a handful of weathered buildings clinging to the edge of a vast, indifferent wilderness. It was a place of last chances, and she was down to her last dollar. She tied Shale to the hitching post outside the county land office, the leather of the reins smooth and familiar in her trembling hand. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and chewing tobacco. A portly clerk with a stained vest looked up from his ledger, his eyes skimming over her patched dress and worn-out boots with casual disdain. "Help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. "I'm looking for land," Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear. "Something to buy." The clerk let out a short, humorless laugh. "Land costs money, girl. A lot more than it looks like you've got." Ilara didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the single heavy coin. It was still cold. She walked to the counter and placed the silver dollar on the scarred wood. It made a small, definitive sound in the quiet room. "I have this," she stated. It wasn't a question. The clerk stared at the coin, then back at her face. The weary determination in her gray eyes seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, he seemed to consider just telling her to leave, but then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a man about to enjoy a private joke at someone else's expense. $1, he mused, tapping a thick finger next to the coin. "Well now, I do believe we have just the parcel for you." He turned and shuffled to a dusty shelf, pulling down a thin, forgotten-looking file. He blew a cloud of dust from the cover and opened it with a flourish. "The old Althea Lode," he announced. "Played out silver claim up in Whisperwind Canyon. Got a miner's shack on it. All yours. For $1. The way he said it, the offer was an insult in itself, a final confirmation of what Silas's gesture had begun. But Ilara Vance looked at the deed, her name waiting to be written on the line, and saw not an insult, but a foothold. The clerk's smile widened as he explained the terms of this dubious transaction. "The Althea Lode," he said, wasn't so much a property as a problem the county wanted off its books. The silver vein had run dry 60 years ago, the original claimant long dead and gone. The cabin, he assured her with a wink, was mostly still standing, provided you didn't lean on it too hard. The mine shaft itself was collapsed and boarded over, a tomb of rock and failed dreams. The land's no good for grazing, no good for farming, the clerk droned on. Just rock, thistle, and wind. We keep it on the ledger for $1 for tax purposes. You're the first person foolish enough to ask about it in 20 years. Just then, the door to the land office swung open, letting in a rectangle of blinding sunlight and a large, loud man who seemed to fill the entire room. He wore a fine leather coat and a wide-brimmed hat that bespoke prosperity. This was Jedediah Thorne, a rancher whose holdings spread across the valley floor, a man whose voice was accustomed to being obeyed. He glanced at Alara, then at the deed on the counter, and let out a booming laugh that made the dusty windows rattle. "Don't tell me you found a buyer for the old ghost trap, Henry!" Thorne bellowed at the clerk. He looked Alara up and down, his eyes filled with a dismissive, pitying amusement. "Buying the Althea lode, are you, girl? Planning on mining moonbeams and misery? That's all that's left up there." Alara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. She would not be shamed. She had been dismissed by one man already. She would not let another's scorn break her. She dipped the offered pen into the inkwell, her hand steady, and signed her name, Alara Vance, on the deed. The scratch of the nib on the dry paper was the sound of her planting a flag in a barren land. She pushed the silver dollar across the counter. The dollar her stepfather had used to cast her out was now the dollar she was using to claim a place of her own. It was a bitter trade, but it was hers. The clerk, Henry, stamped the document with a heavy thud and slid it toward her. "She's all yours," he said, barely suppressing a snicker. "The wind, the rocks, and the ghosts." Thorne was still chuckling to himself as Alara folded the deed carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She gave a single curt nod and turned to leave, her back straight, her dignity a thin but resilient shield against their mockery. The single dollar was gone. In its place was a piece of paper that promised her a pile of rotting wood and worthless stone. It was, by any sane measure, a fool's bargain. What secret could a pile of rocks and rotting wood possibly hold? Was this young woman's dollar and her last hope truly wasted on a forgotten canyon? Let us know in the comments what you think she'll find. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. But as Alara rode out of town, deed in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin, against all logic, was waiting for her for a reason. The town of Dust Devil Gulch watched her go. As Alara led Shale to the general store to spend the last of her pocket change, she could feel their eyes on her. The story of her purchase had already made its way from the land office to the saloon, carried on whispers and puffs of laughter. She was the dollar girl, the latest bit of frontier folly for the town to chew on. At the store, she bought a small sack of flour, a tin of salt, a handful of nails, and a single candle. The storekeeper counted out her coins with a pitying slowness, as if each one were a tear. He didn't meet her eyes. She was already a ghost to them, a walking cautionary tale. As she stepped back out onto the dusty street, securing her meager provisions to Shale's saddle, an old woman sitting on a weathered bench caught her eye. She was ancient, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a stillness that seemed at odds with the town's restless gossip. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't whispering. She was simply watching Alara with a strange, unnerving focus. As Alara passed, the old woman spoke, her voice as dry and soft as rustling leaves. "Some roots," she said, not to Ilara but to the air between them, "grow best in stone." Ilara paused, the cryptic words hanging in the air. She didn't know what they meant, but she felt their weight. It was not a warning, not quite a blessing, but something else entirely. She nodded to the old woman, a small gesture of acknowledgement, and the woman gave a slow, deliberate blink in return. Her brief, strange encounter was shattered by Jedediah Thorne's booming voice from across the street. He stood with a group of men outside the saloon, a cigarillo clamped in his teeth. "There she is, the Baroness of Broken Timbers," he called out, and his companions roared with laughter. "Enjoy the company of the wind and the ghosts up there, girl. That's all that claim has ever paid out." Ilara's jaw tightened. She focused on adjusting a strap on Shale's saddle, her movements precise and deliberate. She would not give him the satisfaction of her anger or her tears. She had learned from her stepfather that silence was a language powerful men did not understand and could not defeat. She finished her task, swung herself up onto Shale's back, and turned him toward the steep, winding trail that led out of town and up into the high country. As the last buildings of Dust Devil Gulch fell away behind her, the laughter faded, replaced by the rising whistle of the wind. The trail to Whisperwind Canyon was little more than a goat path, winding up through jagged rock and stunted, wind-twisted pines. The sky was darkening, the clouds gathering in bruised shades of purple and gray. A storm was coming, both in the sky and in her heart. She thought of her mother, who had always found beauty in the harshest landscapes. She would have seen the grace in the gnarled pines, the strength in the unyielding granite. Then, a kinder memory surfaced. Ben, the old farrier from their previous town, a man with hands as tough as leather but a gentle touch with horses. He had been her mother's friend, and he had taught Ilara how to read a horse's mood by the flick of an ear, how to calm it with a soft word. Shale, her silent companion on this lonely journey, was a testament to that teaching. The steady, rhythmic plod of his hooves on the rocky ground was a comfort, a connection to a time when she had not been so utterly alone. The trail grew steeper, and the first drops of cold rain began to fall. She pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and urged Shale onward into the heart of the canyon that everyone had told her was worthless. The journey into Whisperwind Canyon was a battle against the land itself. The trail all but disappeared in places, forcing Ilara to dismount and lead Shale over treacherous scree slopes and through thickets of thorny brush. The wind, true to the canyon's name, howled through the rock formations, a mournful, constant song that seemed to pull the warmth from her bones. Shale was magnificent. The old horse, dismissed by many as past his prime, moved with a steady, certain grace, placing each hoof with an instinctual wisdom that shamed Ilara's own tentative steps. He was her anchor in this wild, unwelcoming place. They arrived at the claim just as dusk was bleeding the last of the color from the sky. The cabin stood in a small, rock-strewn clearing, silhouetted against the bruised clouds. It was exactly as the clerk had described, and somehow worse. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. One of the two windows was a gaping hole, the other boarded over with mismatched planks. The door hung from a single rusted hinge, swaying slightly in the wind. Next to it, the entrance to the Althea lode was a dark, forbidding maw, covered with heavy, graying timbers nailed shut with a grim finality. The entire place radiated a profound and ancient loneliness. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over Ilara. This was her inheritance, a pile of ruin. Thorne and the townspeople, Their mocking laughter echoed in the wind. They had been right. She slid from Shale's back, her legs trembling with exhaustion and disappointment. For a long, heart-stopping moment, she considered turning back, riding down into the darkness and just keeping going. Going where she didn't know. Anywhere but here. Then Shale nudged her hand with his soft nose, his warm breath a puff of comfort against her cold skin. He looked at her with his dark, knowing eyes, as if to say, "We are here now." Ilara reached into her pocket, and her fingers found the folded deed. The paper was stiff, real. This place, this broken, forgotten place, was hers. It was the only thing in the entire world that was. "All right, boy," she whispered, her voice rough. "We'll stay." She knew better than to risk sleeping inside the derelict cabin. The roof looked ready to collapse under the weight of a strong gust. Instead, she found a relatively sheltered spot against a rock wall a few yards away. She unsaddled Shale and rubbed him down as best she could, then used what little energy she had left to gather scrub brush for a small fire. The flames sputtered to life, a tiny orange beacon against the encroaching dark. She ate a piece of dry bread, sharing a small portion with her horse, and huddled in her blanket, watching the cabin. In the flickering firelight, the empty window looked like a vacant eye, watching her. The place didn't feel threatening, just sad, as if it had been waiting a very long time. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she drifted into a troubled sleep, the sound of the wind her only lullaby. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she was jolted awake. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The wind had momentarily ceased its howling, and in the sudden ringing silence, she heard it. A sound. It was faint, rhythmic, and seemed to come from deep within the earth. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the sound of a rock settling or a branch falling. It was measured, deliberate. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She strained her ears, listening. The sound seemed to emanate from the direction of the boarded-up mine shaft. After a few seconds, it stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Was she losing her mind? Or was she not as alone in Whisperwind Canyon as she had believed? In the clear, cold light of morning, the tapping sound felt like a figment of a weary imagination. Ilara told herself it was a woodpecker, or the strange acoustics of the canyon, or simply a dream. She had more immediate concerns. Survival. Her first priority was water. She left Shale to graze on the sparse patches of grass and began a systematic search of her small plot of land. For hours, she found nothing but rock and dust. Despair began to creep back in, a familiar chill. But then, tucked away in a small ravine behind the cabin, she saw it. A patch of damp earth, a cluster of green, stubborn ferns. She dug with her hands, frantically at first, then with more care, until she uncovered a small, choked spring. The water that bubbled up was slow and muddy, but it was clear and cold. It was life. This small victory felt monumental, a sign that the land was not entirely against her. With water secured, she turned her attention to the cabin. If she was to survive the coming winter, she needed shelter. She pushed open the groaning, half-hinged door and stepped inside. The interior was a scene of utter decay. Decades of dust lay thick on every surface, stirred into dancing motes by the light slanting through the broken roof. The floor was littered with debris and the droppings of small animals. A stone fireplace, choked with rubble, stood against one wall. It was a daunting task, but work was something Ilara understood. She began to clean, using a pine branch as a makeshift broom. As she swept away the layers of filth in the far corner, her broom snagged on a raised edge. She knelt down for a closer look and saw something that didn't fit. The floorboards in this small section were different from the rest. The surrounding planks were wide, rough-hewn pine, dark with age and secured with square-headed, hand-forged nails. But these 3 boards were narrower, made of a lighter-colored, smoother wood, aspen perhaps, and fastened with smaller, round-headed nails of a kind she hadn't seen before. They looked newer, placed with a different purpose. Later that afternoon, her curiosity drew her to the boarded-up mine entrance. The timbers were immense, weathered to a silver gray and hard as iron. Heavy, rusted spikes held them in place, driven deep into the frame. It looked impenetrable. But as her eyes traveled down the barrier, she noticed something on the lowest board, just above the ground. Carvings. They weren't letters or numbers. They were symbols, deliberately etched into the wood. A delicate spiral, a 5-pointed star, and a perfect crescent moon. They weren't the idle whittling of a bored miner. They felt like a code, a secret language. A name floated up from her memory. The name on the deed, the old Althea Lode. It was a woman's name. Prospectors and miners were men. Gruff, hard men like Silas or Thorne. Who was Althea? The name felt as out of place here as the aspen floorboards and the cryptic symbols. The tapping in the night, the newer planks, the strange carvings. They were 3 disparate facts that refused to make sense on their own. But together, they felt like the beginning of a question. Ilara didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker not of hope, but of profound, unsettling curiosity. This place had a story, and she was standing on the first page. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of pure, unadulterated labor. Ilara Vance was no stranger to work, but this was different. This wasn't for Silas or for anyone else. It was for her. Every nail she hammered, every stone she lifted, was an act of claiming her own life. She started with the roof, using fallen timber from the surrounding woods and a bucket of mud mixed with dry grass. She painstakingly patched the holes, her hands quickly becoming a geography of calluses and cuts. She found the broken hinge for the door, and with Shale's patient help as a brace, she managed to rehang it. The solid thud of the door closing for the first time echoed in the canyon, a sound of permanence. Her silent companion, Shale, was ever present. He would stand for hours in the thin sunlight, watching her work, his ears occasionally flicking at the sound of her hammer. His quiet presence was a constant source of strength. He was a living reminder that not everything beautiful was loud, not everything valuable shone. He was steady and loyal, and that was enough. Her biggest challenge was the fireplace. It had partially collapsed, the chimney blocked with a mess of stones and old birds' nests. It took her 2 full days to clear it, her face and clothes black with soot. As she was carefully resetting the stones around the hearth, one of them came loose in her hand. It was heavier than the others, and felt oddly shaped. Behind it, where it had sat for who knows how long, was a small, dark hollow. Her heart quickened. Treasure? She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something small, dry, and delicate. She pulled it out. It was a flower, perfectly preserved, its petals turned to stone. It was a pale, star-shaped bloom, of a kind she had never seen growing in the harsh canyon soil. It felt like a secret. She wrapped it carefully in a small piece of cloth and tucked it away in her satchel. The mystery of the different floorboards in the corner continued to bother her. Every time she swept the floor, her eyes would linger on them. The work had taught her patience. She didn't rush. But one afternoon, with the cabin mostly secured against the elements, she decided it was time. She took the claw end of her hammer and, with great care, began to work at the edge of the first aspen plank. The nails resisted, groaning in protest, but finally gave way. She lifted the board. The air that rose from the darkness below was not the musty, stagnant air of a forgotten cellar. It was cool and clean, with a strange, earthy smell, and underneath that, something else. A faint, sweet, floral scent, like crushed herbs or night-blooming flowers. It was the same scent that clung faintly to the petrified flower she had found in the fireplace. In that instant, two things clicked together in her mind: the scent and the rhythmic tapping she had heard that first night. It hadn't come from the main mine shaft outside. It had come from directly beneath her feet. With a growing sense of urgency and wonder, she pried up the second board. Below her, illuminated by a sliver of sunlight, was not a dirt floor, but the top rungs of a sturdy wooden ladder, descending into absolute blackness. The darkness beneath the floorboards was a palpable presence. It seemed to breathe a cool, ancient air up into the cabin. Ilara knew she had to go down. She couldn't leave the question unanswered. She fashioned a torch from a dry pine branch, smearing it with pitch she'd scraped from the trees. With the flame casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls, she took a deep breath and swung her legs over the edge. The ladder was solid, its rungs worn smooth by use. She descended, one rung at a time, into the heart of the mountain. The ladder ended in a small, hand-dug chamber. It was not a root cellar or a simple storage pit. The walls were surprisingly smooth, the floor level. The air was still and cold, silent as a tomb. Her torchlight flickered across the confined space. 3 of the walls were packed earth and rock, but the fourth wall, the one facing the interior of the mountain, was different. It was a carefully constructed wall of fitted stones, mortared with clay. She ran her hand over its surface. It was a false wall. She realized with a jolt that this chamber was a sealed-off portion of the Althea lode. Someone had deliberately walled this section away from the main mine, creating a hidden entrance right under the cabin. Her eyes scanned the chamber again, and this time she saw it. A small alcove carved into the rock next to the false wall. And inside the alcove sat a metal tin box. It was rusted and dented, but the lid seemed to be sealed shut with hardened wax. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it back up the ladder, her mind racing. Back in the relative brightness of the cabin, she used the tip of her knife to carefully break the wax seal and pry open the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a leather-bound journal, a small, tightly tied pouch, and a roll of brittle, yellowed papers. She unrolled the papers first. They were exquisite, detailed sketches of plants, rock formations, and crystals, drawn with a scientific precision and an artist's hand. She opened the small pouch. It was filled with tiny, dark seeds of a dozen different varieties. Finally, she opened the journal. The first page read, in elegant, faded script, "The property of Althea Rosamond, geologist and botanist. Year of our Lord, 1827. Althea wasn't a miner's wife. She was the miner. Or rather, she was a scientist." As Ilara read, Althea's story unfolded, a secret kept by the mountain for over 60 years. She had come to the canyon not for silver or gold, but to study its unique geology. She had discovered that the water from the hidden spring, filtered through veins of a specific crystalline mineral, possessed unique properties. And deep within the caves, protected from the sun, this water nourished an incredible hidden ecosystem. She was cultivating a subterranean garden of rare, phosphorescent mosses and lichens that glowed with a soft, ethereal light. The sketches were her catalog. The mine wasn't played out. Its true wealth had never been understood. Althea had sealed the main entrance and built the secret one to protect her discovery from prospectors who would have torn the mountain apart for a few ounces of precious metal. The symbols on the outer boards were her own private markers for the seasons of her garden. And then, Ilara read a passage that made her blood run cold with wonder. Althea described how, in the deepest chamber, water from a single stalactite dripped onto a large, resonant crystal formation, creating a faint, rhythmic tapping sound that echoed through the rock. The mountain's heartbeat, she called it. Ilara sat back, the journal open in her lap, the dusty cabin around her seeming to fade away. She had not inherited a worthless, collapsed mine. She was the new keeper of a secret sanctuary, a hidden world of quiet, living light. The dollar she had spent was not for a piece of dead land, but for the key to a miracle. The mountain tested her resolve almost immediately. A week after her discovery, the weather turned. An early winter storm, born in the high peaks, descended on the canyon with a terrifying fury. The wind shrieked like a predator, and snow began to fall, thick and fast, burying the landscape in a blanket of white. Ilara and Shale were trapped. The trail back to Dust Devil Gulch would be impassable, a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to try it. She had to trust the shelter she had built, the cabin she had painstakingly mended. For 2 days, the blizzard raged. She kept the fire in her newly rebuilt hearth roaring, the warmth a fragile defense against the howling cold. Shale was safe in a small lean-to she had constructed against the cabin's most sheltered wall. During the long hours of isolation, she sat by the fire, reading Althea's journal by the light of her single candle. The words of the long-dead botanist were a comfort, a conversation across the decades. Ilara felt a profound kinship with this woman, who had also found solace and purpose in this lonely place. On the second night, as the storm reached its peak, a new sound cut through the wind's howl, a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Ilara's heart leapt into her throat. Who could possibly be out in this? She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood as a weapon and cautiously pulled the door open a crack. A man stood on her threshold, his face caked with snow, his eyes wide with panic. Behind him, a woman was slumped over, half-conscious, with a small child bundled in her arms. "Please," the man begged, his voice hoarse. "Our wagon. Broken axle on the lower trail. My wife. The baby's coming." Without a second's hesitation, Ilara threw the door wide. She helped the man, Samuel, carry his wife inside and settle her near the fire. The woman, Mary, was shivering violently, her face pale. Their little boy, no more than 4, stared at Ilara with huge, frightened eyes. They had been trying to reach the next territory before the deep winter set in, and had been caught by the storm's sudden violence. Now, Mary was in the throes of early labor, brought on by the cold and the stress. Ilara worked quickly, her fear replaced by a focused calm. She heated water, tore strips from her spare blanket for swaddling, and did her best to comfort the terrified couple. Hours passed. Her candle burned down to a stub, and her lantern oil was running dangerously low. The cabin was descending into a frightening darkness, the only light coming from the flickering embers in the hearth. Then, an idea sparked, born of Althea's pages. It was a risk, but she had to try. Excusing herself for a moment, she grabbed a glass jar, lit a splinter of wood for a tiny torch, and disappeared down the ladder into the hidden chamber. She moved quickly to the place Althea had described as the Grotto of First Light. There, clinging to the damp rock walls, was the moss. It pulsed with a soft, blue-green luminescence, a cool, living light. Carefully, she scraped a thick patch of it into the jar, sealed the lid, and hurried back up. When she entered the cabin, the family gasped. The jar of moss filled the small room with a gentle, otherworldly glow. It was a calm, serene light, like captured starlight. In that strange, beautiful, and holy light, a short time later, Mary's child, a healthy baby girl, was born. The storm still raged outside, but inside the $1 cabin, a new life had begun, welcomed into the world by the secret light of the mountain. When the storm finally broke on the third day, the world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. Inside the cabin, the small family was safe and warm. Samuel, the father, could not stop staring at the jar of glowing moss, which still emitted its soft, steady light. "What is this place?" he asked Alara, his voice filled with an awe that bordered on reverence. Alara simply smiled, a gesture that felt new on her face. As soon as the lower trail was passable, Samuel made his way down to Dust Devil Gulch. He returned not with scorn or pity for the town's dollar girl, but with a story that defied belief. He told everyone who would listen about the blizzard, the broken wagon, and the young woman in the abandoned mine cabin who had saved them. He spoke of her quiet competence, her generosity with what little she had, and he spoke with a stammering wonder of the birth of his daughter by the light of living stars, a strange, glowing moss she had gathered from within the mountain itself. The story spread through the town like a brush fire. It was too fantastic, too specific to be a simple lie. The town's mockery, which had been so loud and confident, faltered, replaced by a murmur of curiosity and disbelief. The kind professional of the town, a thoughtful, educated man named Dr. Abram, was intrigued. He was a physician, but also an amateur botanist. The idea of a bioluminescent moss in those mountains seemed impossible, yet Samuel's sincerity was undeniable. He saddled his horse and made the difficult ride up to Whisperwind Canyon to check on the mother and her newborn. He found Alara outside, calmly brushing down shale. The cabin behind her no longer looked derelict. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the newly mended door was painted with a wash of berry juice, giving it a soft, welcoming color. Dr. Abram examined Mary and the baby, declaring them both perfectly healthy. Afterward, Alara, with a shy reluctance, showed him a small sample of the moss. The doctor took one look, pulling a magnifying glass from his bag. He was speechless. He recognized it from drawings in obscure academic journals. It was Luminaria petrea, a species thought to be extinct for a century, prized not for any monetary value, but for its unique biological properties. Some ancient texts even claimed it had calming, healing qualities. He looked at Alara, his expression one of profound respect. "You are a custodian, Miss Vance," he said quietly, "not a prospector. This is a significant discovery." Jedediah Thorne heard the stories, of course. Full of bluster and suspicion, he rode up to the cabin himself, determined to expose the hoax. He found Alara chopping wood, the quiet rhythm of her axe a steady heartbeat in the canyon. Samuel's family was there, packing their mended wagon, their faces alight with gratitude as they thanked her. Thorne saw the cabin, no longer a ruin but a home. He saw the healthy baby wrapped in a warm blanket. And as dusk began to fall, he saw a soft, blue-green light begin to emanate from the cabin window. He froze. There was nothing to say. There was no argument to be made. He had declared this place dead, and this young woman had filled it with life and light. Without a single word, Jedediah Thorne turned his expensive horse around and rode away, humbled not by a confrontation, but by the quiet, irrefutable truth of what she had built. Soon after, others from the town began to arrive, not as gawkers, but as pilgrims bearing gifts, a sack of potatoes, a bolt of wool, a set of iron pots. They no longer saw the foolish girl who had wasted $1. They saw the woman who had found a miracle. Spring came to Whisperwind Canyon, and with it, an explosion of life. The slopes, once thought barren, were carpeted with wildflowers Ilara had never noticed before. The seeds from Althea's pouch, planted in a small garden she'd tilled by hand, had sprouted into strange and wonderful plants. Ilara was no longer alone. Samuel's family, grateful beyond words, had built their own small homestead in the lower part of the canyon, close enough to help. The story of the Angel of the Canyon had transformed her from an outcast into a quiet pillar of a new, burgeoning community. She did not become rich, not in the way Jedediah Thorne or the men of Dust Devil Gulch understood the word. The glowing moss was not for sale. It was the sacred heart of the sanctuary, a secret to be protected, not exploited. Following the careful instructions in Althea's journal and with guidance from Dr. Abram, who now visited regularly to document the unique flora, Ilara established a small apothecary. She learned the properties of the canyon's plants, creating remedies, salves, and teas that she traded for supplies. Her cabin became a place of healing. People would come up from the town, not just for her remedies, but for the profound peace that seemed to settle over the canyon. She would, on occasion, guide small, respectful groups into the upper, safer chambers of the old mine to see the earth stars, asking only for quiet reverence in return. One evening, at golden hour, Dr. Abram stood with her at the cabin's entrance. The setting sun bathed the canyon in a warm, honeyed light, and inside the cabin, the moss in its jar was beginning to answer the twilight with its own soft, blue-green glow. "The whole town still calls it the old Althea Lode," the doctor said, puffing on his pipe. "It doesn't seem fitting anymore. Have you thought of giving it a new name?" Ilara looked out at her world. She saw the sturdy cabin she had rebuilt with her own hands. She saw her small, thriving garden, a patch of impossible green against the rock. She saw the mine entrance, no longer a symbol of failure and death, but a doorway to wonder and life. She thought of the seeds, the newborn baby, the community that was slowly putting down roots in this once forgotten place. A slow smile touched her lips. "It's not a mine," she said, her voice quiet but certain, carrying the entire moral of her journey in its simple truth. "It's a nursery. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet triumph. It's a reminder that true value is often hidden, waiting not for a pickaxe, but for a patient hand. If you were moved by Ilara's journey, please like this video and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. We'll be back next week with the story of a lone blacksmith who inherited a rusted, broken anvil, only to discover the songs hammered into its steel could change a town's future.